Hey, glory to Jesus Christ. Glory forever. This is Father Anthony, and this is my full head. So there it is. There's my head. Got the Bolshoi lobe, right? It's got the big forehead going on. Yeah, my full head. Yeah, this is a show where, if you ever wanted to get together over coffee with a friend who's a priest, a friend who's a political scientist, and a friend who, what else are we going to pick? I don't know. Who is a retired intelligence officer, and just talk about stuff. That's what this is. And I'm just going to talk about whatever comes into my fool head, and you can influence what comes into my fool head by typing in comments. And if you're watching this asynchronously, so later, you can send me comments. I look for them on YouTube, or you can email me, or whatever. I hope you've had a good week. I hope everything is, if not peaceful, at least trending that way, and not the peace of submission to the world, but the peace that passes all understanding. That comes from a life lived in Christ, so that His peace just fills you and fills your world. It's not an easy place to get to, or it is, but we get in our own way. So today I was thinking that I might share some thoughts with you about concepts that I've found useful. Hey, good morning, Austin. It's good to have you with us here. But I want to start out with just 3 Bible verses that are, they're not foundational. Christ is foundational. But they're always one part of the logismoi that are going around in my head. And one I've shared with you before, and we say it as we're preparing for communion every time. It's one of the Psalms, at least in my prayer book, that we read in preparation for communion. And it's not the part necessarily that you're focusing on, unless you're me. I said in my amazement, every person is a liar, right? And this is, the amazement is David. The proximate amazement is David. And it's an observation about how, man, everybody is just so full of it, even when they're trying to be sincere, like St. Paul. He groans, I try to do good, and I do not. And then another one that is very much a part of our psalm life. So one of the ways Orthodoxy is structured is that we have the repetition of psalms. So even if we don't live in a monastery, so even if we're not repeating psalms every week, all the psalms every week, through our, following the cycle of services, we still have the repetition of certain psalms over and over again throughout our lives that become part of the way that we think. And that's the pattern, right? Is to pattern our thoughts according to, not just Scripture. You can speak in the tongues of men and angels, and even in the language of Scripture. And if you don't have love, it's just like noise. But if we are dedicated to peace and we can constantly return ourselves to that through repentance, then these psalms help to guide us. And one of them is, if you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, who should stand? Right? If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who should stand? Right? And this is a prokeimen that we say, a little bit of psalm that we say pretty regularly. But there's forgiveness with you is the rest of it, right? You're like, Father, say the rest of it, say the rest of it. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? That's Psalm 130. And it's true, right? No matter how far along we are in this Christian life, in a life dedicated to holiness, we're not going to get it all right. And even when we do, there's very little things that we can do in our lives that are where all virtues line up perfectly. So this is them lining up, and this is usually what it is. It's like this, So if you're going to maximize, say I'm a political scientist, you're going to get this kind of dead language. That if you're going to maximize one virtue, you're often going to do it at the expense of another. So, part of discernment is figuring out, having the prudence to recognize which virtue is most operative in any given situation. And that's important. That's part of discernment. And repentance means every time that they don't line up, recognizing that, man, I can't be dead to these other virtues. I have to completely dedicate myself 100% to a life of virtue, which means all of the virtues. Because if I have to sacrifice one in order to live well in a moment, I cannot lose the sense of importance of the other virtues that I've sacrificed in that moment, right? Because the goal is holiness. But in a fallen world, they don't align. We look forward to the world where they do, where every action is a movement from grace to higher grace, right? And what you have here is as a life of compromise. And by compromise, I'm not speaking about some kind of moral relativism. I hope you understand that. And I'll just hear, you might be like, hey, Father Anthony, I don't live in a world of abstractions. Can you give me an example? Yeah. So, you're walking through your town and somebody asks you for money, right? Okay. The virtue of charity would say, yes, of course, I see Christ in you here, right? Now, if that money, you were on the way to the bank to pay a bill that will keep the lights on in your house or keep the bank from foreclosing on your mortgage, you are sacrificing one good for another. If, on the other hand, you said, no, but I can't, I need everything that I have, but, and you try to find another way to help, you have sacrificed one good for the sake of another. And that's the way this world is. It's not a fun place to be, right? A lot of times. But we turn that over to God, and we don't lose. So if I do that at the expense of my connection to the person suffering on the street, or if I do it and I lose connection to the need to responsibly care for my family, then I have sacrificed capital V virtue for the sake of the needs of the moment, right? And that's not good. We're not to do that. Anyways, if you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? But there is forgiveness with you. And I'm going to come back to that. And then the last one, what is truth, right? And the thing that I love about that one, the first ones are just, they're kind of like, oh man, this is messed up. I said in my amazement, everyone's just full of it, right? And then the second one, hey, look, if you, O Lord, man, if you've paid attention to all the things that I get wrong, no one could stand, right? But there's forgiveness with you. Thank God. So it's throwing up your hands like, man, this is messed up, but thank God. Thank God. So my point about that one, about the virtues and stuff, is even if you're well along your way to holiness, not only are you going to make obvious mistakes, things that people are like, yeah, you drank too much or whatever it was, you lost your temper. Someone can evaluate you on the virtue that you did not discern to be primary in the moment. It was the one that you sacrificed, and they will flip it and say, you're the greatest of sinners because you neglected this good, right? So if you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, and then I turn that, because we are all being invited to be part of the divine counsel of God. Don't you know that you will judge the angels? We are called to responsibility, and certainly to pastoral responsibility now. So if we just mark iniquities, who could stand? But that's what we've done. And that's what our society is increasingly encouraging us, is to mark iniquities. And to do it in an uncharitable manner, where you frame things against their intent. You intentionally misperceive what they are doing. And that's a problem. And then the last one, what is truth? Yeah. So the last one is, it's not the same. It's a different category. All of them are a little bit different, but this one is a completely different category, because this is Pilate saying, this, there is no truth in politics, or whatever it was he was saying. And of course, truth is standing right in front of him. What is truth indeed? I'm here. I'm the Logos, says Christ, with his witness. Right? So those are the three verses that kind of are going to triangulate as I just talk. Right? There are others, of course. But the concept I'd like to share with you is framing. But before we get to that, do you have your coffee? I hope you have your coffee. This is pretty good coffee. This, my parish in Waynesville, the one that I serve, they gave me beans from a local roaster, and it is excellent. It is, though, full caffeine, so I cut it with some Dunkin' Donuts, or now it's just Dunkin', some Dunkin' decaf, so that my heart stays within its sustainable bounds. Yeah, and so the coffee's good. I've been for my run. I haven't lifted weights. I didn't get up early enough, so I'll do that after this. But I've been for my jog, I should say. I've got prosphora dough rising on the stove. I've got the hot water in the stove, in the oven on, so it's ready to go. Once we're done here, I'll roll that out and put it in a pan, right? And that'll be good. So got that going. Got some laundry going. So things are cooking here at the... I know. Austin points out that decaf is heresy. I know. Have you seen that post? I wish I could remember where it came from, but I think it's from a Lutheran site where they list, I saw it. Father Andrew Damick sent it around a few years ago. All the heresies of coffee, right? Yeah, fantastic. I know. It's, yeah, what can I say? I don't know. Is it a heresy? It would be a heresy. If it's wrong, it is a heresy, because I used to drink full-strength coffee, and now I've rejected full-strength to cut it with decaf. So, yeah, this is some kind of synchronistic rejection of, what I knew to be true. So, yeah, that would be, I think we need to convene a council. Certainly an intervention. So Austin is actually doing the biblical thing, the correct thing. He sees me in my mistake, and he corrects me, right? You did it in public, but maybe you're the only one. You're the only one watching this right now, so it's actually private. So I commend you, Austin, for doing this in private. If I do not listen and continue to drink decaf, I encourage you to do an intervention with a few of our friends. If that doesn't work, then you convene the council, right? Would it be heresy if I switched to tea? Yeah, these are the jokes. Right? This is, for those of you who are just befuddled right now, this counts as Orthodox humor, right? And it's what you get, and every kind of subculture has its own humor. And this is the humor of that kind of academic Orthodox milieu. And in the army, it was all dark humor, right? It was humor about death and sadness, right? And you laugh. Yeah, but it's all good. Okay. So what I want to start with is framing. That's the concept that I think is useful. And I hinted at it a little bit when I was talking about virtues. So you can frame your response. Framing, think of it as, I'm setting up a picture. And the way that my frame determines what I focus on, and how it also does more. It's how I evaluate it. And social scientists run experiments where there'll be an event. I remember this one from 25 years ago. They ran this one at Ohio State when I was there. So there was a protest downtown on Columbus Day, and Ohio State is in Columbus, Ohio. So, there you go. We had a replica of the Nina, I think, on the river there, downtown. And then there was a statue of Columbus. And there were protests against Columbus Day. And one of the news channels, when they were presenting it, they framed it as a law and order thing. So they focused on the way that the protesters disrupted the rhythm of the of the city, right? The things that they had done that were counter to proper behavior and even legal behavior. So that was one frame. So someone would come in fresh and they would see that. And if they were pro law and order, if that was part of their worldview, then it would get them to evaluate that and maybe whatever they saw afterwards in terms of that frame, because it had been primed. Yeah, that's another word, right? So that's what they were going to be watching it for. Another show, though, could frame it in a different way. And since we're trying to elicit the opposite response, right? So that first one would elicit opposition, and unless someone was an anarchist or pro-chaos or something like that, or was just politically astute and could de-spin it. And let's say the second one did it in terms of, promoting sympathy towards Native Americans, right? And did it that way. So interviewed the protesters to find out what their beef was and did it in a sympathetic manner, right? So it was framed in that way. And if you care about your fellow human being and you just came in fresh, right, you would be like, oh, that's so nice that they were down there, right? And then those two people could go talk, and one of them would say, did you see what they did downtown? And the other one would say, oh, yeah, warm fuzzy. And the other one would be like, no, bad, cold water, right? Okay, so it's framing. And worldviews, of course, have frames that come naturally to them, okay? And so the pejorative term for framing is spin, okay? And a lot of the people talking past each other in the world is because they're listening to the data being presented, but they're interpreting it using a different frame than the other person and not even recognizing that's going on. So it's not just different worldviews, because worldviews tend to overlap at least at some point, but frames don't. Frames, you have to step outside of the frame in order to figure out what the other person is saying, right? And someone who's trained in active listening will listen for that. What is the frame? What is the disconnect between, this? Because, if you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, man, I can come up with every kind of reason to demonize you, right? Or to dismiss your opinion by, yes, I can pick on the data, right? But let's just say that the data is fairly secure here. But by just switching the frame and just showing, oh, yeah, look, that's nonsense. And we went through this with COVID. Oh, Lord have mercy, it was so painful. And each side can accuse the other side of being disingenuous. And they were both operating in bad faith, to be honest. Because one side, the side that happened to have power, said we are only going to interpret our response to COVID in terms of harm and care. So there's a moral category, a moral instinct, right? And that's it. We're not going to accept anything else. And the other side would say, we're only operating, we are operating according to liberty, or we are operating according to harm, care, downstream, or something like that. They would bring in some kind of a criticism, and it would be completely dismissed as, you hate puppies, And the other side would say, well, you're a tyrant. And those positions just hardened over time, and they got further and further away. And if you're married, or if you actually have friends who aren't so scared of you that they'll tell you things you don't want to hear, you learn how to listen to other people's frames and evaluate them, and then you can figure out, okay, yes, the virtue of harm care, taking care of people lines up this way, but the need for, it's a primary need for freedom, lines up here. downstream costs line up here, and then as a society, you pick out how you're gonna feed those in. That was not an honest conversation, and because the side that had power, controlled the policy and stuff, it pushed the people who agreed, yeah, we need to do things safely. It pushed them away so that you end up with where we got, and it's perfectly ugly. It's just, and we have to heal now because it infiltrated our parishes, right? So now when authority comes and says, hey, a year ago, this was when this was going on. Now we're out of it, as Lord willing, said, okay, got to wear your mask, right? It fed in. If they were over here, it fed in, and it was automatically framed as tyranny, right? And then you throw in this veneer of theological, forgive me, I just evaluated. I just pushed my own thing. This theological language, which was not generous, not charitable. We did not have a conversation. We had people yelling at each other, and instead of figuring out how to do harmony and figuring out how to use our different penchants, our different instincts for various virtues, to come up with mutual discernment the way that God intended in the Christian church, we have sorted ourselves into these groups where there's internal agreement, but there is no discernment. The discernment that comes from sorted communities is not as prudent as the discernment would be if they were talking and working together. Right? Do you see what I'm saying? So instead, we just we go to our sides, and then we just talk bad about each other. Right? So there's no charity. There's no charity. And this is it's diabolical. If I understand etymology correct, it is diabolical in the etymological sense. I'm not saying that the people who are doing it are possessed or anything like that, but it's not Christian, and we have to repent because it goes against the gospel. And when you go against the gospel, it's like going against gravity. So if I'm going to go against gravity, I can pretend, if I jump off my roof, I can pretend for about a half a second that I'm good, but then reality crashes in as I break my legs. I don't know, maybe I can still do a PLF. Maybe I can still do a parachute landing fall, so I'll only break my arm. But you get my point. If we go against the gospel, if we keep doing things against God's desire that we be one as he is one within the church, then it's not good. We come crashing down. We whatever the spiritual and institutional equivalent of breaking our legs is, and we're starting to see that. We really are. So we gotta get out of it. So framing is just a very powerful thing. So when you hear somebody and they say something that you're like, what in the world? Why do you hate puppies? And that's not what they're saying. Nobody hates puppies, or at least don't assume they're hating puppies, right? Find out. Ask the question like you would to a friend. I don't understand that. Can you explain? Right? And don't just let them explain the facts, okay? Because you're going to poke at facts. The facts aren't the real disagreement, right? If you're talking about the virus and vaccines, and they start poking at CDC data or lauding CDC data, yeah, data's not great. That's not the crux of the argument. There's something else going on, and it's about frames, and frames that are embedded in worldviews. So we have to figure out what is this really about? What's the question behind the question, as Dave Ramsey says? What's really going on here? What's at the basis of our disagreement? And again, if you've done friendship, if you've done marriage for any time at all, this should come naturally to you. And the marriage, and I would say also the friendship, the marriage is an icon of humanity. We say it's an icon of the church, right? But I speak not of marriage, I speak of the church, right, St. Paul? What we're saying, because church is just the people of God, right? It's supposed to be all of humanity, the new Adam, right? The new humanity, the church, right? So we haven't converted everyone yet. We got work to do, but we haven't even converted our own hearts. So anyway, so the things that we do in our marriage, we're supposed to do the things that come natural to us in a healthy marriage are supposed to become the normal order of life in this world as it becomes transformed in Christ. Instead, what do? We go out here and we get rigid in our own frames, and we assume that everyone else is as rigid on the same frame, which means that if they do something we wouldn't do, they are kicking puppies, right? I mean, if that is the way it works. But they're not kicking puppies because they maximized another virtue typically. Now, this doesn't mean that anything goes. Those two people need to come together and figure out what is prudent. And some things you can just say, well, you do it that way, I'll do it this way, and we'll coexist. Okay, fine, right? There are some things, though, that the one side is not holy. It can't be. It's that may be maximizing a virtue, but it's trumped by. And there, I'm not using that as any kind of play on words. It's trumped by. I'm a card player. Yeah, I know it's against the canons. Call my bishop, right? I grew up playing pinochle. So for example, abortion, right? Some people who support abortion, they may be kicking puppies or worse, right? But most of them are, honestly, I work with these people. They are genuinely in love with women who are in really tough circumstances, in poverty and so on. Yeah, okay. That's awful. We, as Christians, we cannot stand when people are in difficult circumstances. But we say this virtue, the virtue of life and protecting the most vulnerable, the unborn, trumps this. Hey, Subdeacon James, good to see you, brother. So, when we're figuring out, someone, and when you're having a conversation with somebody, you need to recognize the value that they're putting forward, right? We go straight to condemnation. I see that you are maximizing this. I share, because we're both dedicated to virtue, right? But then you say, is there a way that we can do that without sacrificing this thing that I recognize as being a greater harm? Right? But we're not doing that. Because we're tribal instead of being discerning. And tribalism can lead to discernment if we're actually working together. And you can set it up, and Madison, Federalist Papers and so on, they wrote about how what you do is you pit interests against each other, pit ambition, and that ambition can be tied to certain frames and virtues, so that you end up with something that looks like discernment, right? You end up with communal progress. And Adam Smith wrote about this both with regard to economic outcomes and with regard to moral outcomes. Okay, so it is possible, but not if you demonize the other, if you delegitimize them from the get-go. So I encourage you, engage this framing thing, and that can lead to more honest conversations. Because the work of figuring out which virtue is most important for the moment is very good. It's one that needs to be done. And by the moment, I don't mean you ignore the future. You always take into account the future. It's a fool who discounts the future, right? Teenagers are notorious, but psychologically, teenagers have a shorter time frame. So when they are figuring out the needs of the moment, it's hard for them. They don't feel the weight of the future as much as you do once you're out of that. And I don't know, I assume it's chemical, psychological, whatever it is. It's routine. So I'm not saying the needs of the moment, only the moment. And that's, again, this is where the COVID conversation was so disingenuous and so unhelpful. You had people with longer time horizons who were saying things like, look, if you shut down the economy in this way, then there are going to be downstream effects that will be terrible. And what I saw, even from some of my Orthodox brothers and sisters, I dare say even from some priests, was you people are concerned about the economy. You are worshiping the market. That's nonsense. If someone is worshiping the market, you're accusing them of kicking puppies, telling them that they care about a market more than they care about people. That is disingenuous. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's not charitable. You're not listening. When someone says that it will harm the market, what they are saying is that it's going to mess up the movement of cargo ships in the Pacific Ocean. So people aren't going to get what they need at the price that they need to get it. It's not going to work. Things are going to break down and people are going to suffer. Because the market is set up in a decentralized way to satisfy the needs of people naturally, right? If you don't buy that, if you think capitalism is some kind of shell game to protect the interests of the powerful, okay, fine. This may not be the best live stream for you, right? Because I know there is hegemony built in that protects the powerful, but I also know the value of decentralizing power and encouraging people to serve the needs of others without being told to. And when you interrupt, but regardless, that's what we had. And when you freeze it, it's hard to get it going, and it's going to have inefficiencies. And when we say inefficiencies, what we mean is people are going to suffer. There's going to be a disruption of jobs, and there's going to be a disruption of supply, food, gas, oil, stuff like that, okay? But this was written off. People said, no, all we care about are, maximizing health. Well, okay. You may or may not do that with this program of locking down the economy, but I can tell you what's going to happen downstream if you do this as a result of locking down the economy. But that wasn't built into any graph. Instead of we only flattening the curve, all this kind of stuff. It was only talked about on that one dimension, which was a critical dimension. Don't hear me wrong. And maybe it's the one to maximize, but that's a decision to take as a people, right? So the way it would have gone in a healthy society is it would have been a conversation. Let's bring in not just people whose only concern is saving lives. And I heard somebody just last week say, it was epidemiologist, right, on one of the podcasts I listened to. Epidemiologist said, every life is critical and worth these policy changes. Okay, so maximizing a virtue that I share, the value of life. Okay, but if you do the math, you're going to end up destroying more people in the long run by having that kind of thing. The actual aerial tables, again, it sounds like when you say, oh, just do the math, right? It sounds like you're being impersonal. No, you're saying that this is not the only calculation. If you do this thing to maximize this specific thing without taking into account these other variables, you are going to end up hurting people. There are going to be unintended consequences that you cannot foresee, and they're going to be worse than the cure. Okay? So in a healthy community, this will be a conversation, right, of active listening. And the right would not say, you are just trying to destroy the economy, because they're not. They're trying to save lives, something that we value as well. See, I just gave it away. I tend conservative on these things, right? So framing, listen to what the other person has said. Recognize what you have in common, your shared humanity. This is from St. Dionysius the Areopagite, right? Difficult thing. I still don't have it, but I wrestle with it pretty much every day. There is no ontological evil. There are only lesser goods, right? Well, now you can see how that doesn't mean that everything's sunshine and roses, right? If you maximize a lower good at the expense of a greater good, that is what most people would call evil. But when you look at it like that, if you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, Lord, who could stand? But there is forgiveness with you, right? If we come to that with that kind of heart, I could tear apart you and your argument apart in a second. But I want to listen to what you have to say. I want to figure out where your heart is. And then together we can figure out a way, right? And let's say that you're further along in holiness, that it's not just bad facts, or it's not just, improper virtues lined up or whatever, that this person is actually sicker than you are. By participating in this conversation, what is really going on. So yeah, you might end up with coming up with a way to get along better and so on. But what you're really doing is you are connecting with them. You're creating a connection with another human being through which grace can flow, through which God's healing love can flow, right? And through which the oneness that God desires, as he says in his high priestly prayer in St. John, that is being manifested. And just like when I go against gravity by jumping off the roof and breaking my legs, right? When you organize yourself according to the way of gravity, then things just kind of work out. Even more so with the case of love, right? With the case of operating in accordance with the logic of the Logos. Watch how people respond to that. And you can shut that down, by the way, by coming in heavy-handed, by trying to teach them, by saying, look at these facts, you got it all wrong and stuff like that. No, build rapport, right? And there's a time to point out to people, no, that's just flat out wrong. You've got the numbers wrong. And we went over that last week, right? No one wants to see anyone killed. No one wants to see anyone who is unarmed killed by police. No one wants to see a minority that has suffered discrimination for a long time being killed by the authority that represents us, right? It's just wrong. So, when someone is, for, what's it called? It's almost over now, but defunding the police, right? This is another one where people were not charitable. They weren't hearing what the other side was saying. So conservatives jumped on that, saying, you don't care about public safety, right? No. If you actually listen to them, they wanted, like in Minneapolis, it failed. I think it was Minneapolis. It failed the thing to reorganize the police department and make it a Department of Public Safety. Now, they were going to try something out. It would have been adjusted. They would have tried. They would have gone too far. Gravity would have come in. They would have pulled it back, right? This is the way it works, especially in a place like America. But they had the facts wrong. The motivation, the thing that got people in the streets was in part a misunderstanding of the facts, right? It led them, and if you didn't listen to last show, go listen to it. The fact is that almost half of liberals believe that over 1,000 unarmed black men are killed by police every year. Actually, it was just for the year 2019, right? That's just a mistake. So you can come in at that point and say, look, we share a frame. I don't want to see anybody killed. I don't want to see black men killed, right? But you're off by, orders of magnitude here. Here's what the level is. We still need to fix it, right? But man, it's not on fire the way you think it is. Okay, and then maybe they'll be able to hear you and not think that you're kicking puppies, right? So framing, and here's the thing about why it's important to do this. So I've talked about why it's important to listen to other people's frames so that you can really understand what they're saying. What virtue are they maximizing? And you can do this. You can start doing it today, right? And If you think about some of the corny self-help books, the ones that are kind of useful teach to do this. Like men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Yeah, I know it's stereotypes. Okay, I get it. Fine. Hey. But you know what? It's got some wisdom embedded in there. And part of that wisdom is people are different. Listen to people and what they're actually saying and not according to the way that you think. All right, but let's talk a little bit about worldview. And by the way, y'all who are listening, you can push back. You can say, yeah, but, and I'm all up for that because I'm full of it. This is my fool head, right? It's foolish. So it is really important when we think about things like framing that we also recognize confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a second concept from social science that just will improve your life today if you recognize it. Confirmation bias is where you see the world the way you expect to see it. You see in the world what you expect to see it. So if you are framing everything as CRT teaches, right? To see everything as power and as a certain kind of power being used consistently over time, you will notice things that support that. The world won't change, the actual data won't change, but you will notice the things that show just how true this is, right? It will make it obvious, and there'll be enough there to where you can support it. It'll cause you to overemphasize those things. You'll paint ambiguous evidence in a way that makes it look like it's obviously in support of your worldview. You'll also ignore or refute evidence that points against your worldview. This is natural. It's automatic. We've studied it so much, we know that it's just part of our fallen state. That we see what we expect to see. It leads us. So, and James can back me up on this. James spent some time in the Army. I spent some time in the Army. One of the things, if you wanted to, I went to a lot of schools, right? The best wisdom I got was from my drill sergeant in basic training. He said, Perkins, when you show up to a new place, show up with your best haircut, show up with your best pressed uniform, and on your best behavior. He said, you'll be able to skate from then on. I was the platoon guide the whole time through basic, so he kind of mentored me a little bit. And it's true. You would show up, if you showed up, as long as you weren't like grossly overweight or something like that, you show up with a good haircut, high and tight, right? You show up with a good uniform, polished boots, and a good attitude. Man, because what they see is, oh, Perkins is a good soldier, and especially if you have that airborne, yeah, you got that. Sorry, James, I know. Things go better in Bradleys. I get that. I get it. Okay. Forgive me, were you a tanker or a Bradley guy? Because if I get that wrong, James is coming after me. So I got a few states for me to get to him and say, well, I didn't mean it. I really meant this other thing. But because what they saw was a good soldier, right? First impressions are so important, right? And so they would be inclined not to notice by their psychology things that you did that, other people, if they didn't show up with a good haircut, they get nailed for it, right? Because the jury was still out on whether they were a good soldier, or they showed up in the wrong uniform, or had a bad attitude, hadn't shaved well. It doesn't matter how well that person does. It takes a lot of contrary evidence to make up for that kind of thing. So all this is about confirmation bias. Why is that important? Why am I saying that? Well, for one, it's just useful. Because you know that I said in my amazement, everyone is a liar, right? Confirmation bias is one of the main reasons why we're liars, and why we need other people to point out when we're full of it, right? You need to have friends in your life who are going to tell you, who are going to call you into account, who think differently than you. Yeah? So, but here's the thing, confirmation bias, it's baked in, that we're going to do it. But here's the thing. I said earlier that it was part of our fallen psychology. If we lived in a holy culture, then confirmation bias might actually be for my sanctification, right? Because I would only notice the things that I'm supposed to notice. Okay, you might say, yeah, well, if we were in a holy culture, we'd notice everything. You can't notice everything, right? So worldviews are critical. But if we had like a worldview that we inherited by living within a holy culture, then these psychological mechanisms like monkey see, monkey do, all these things would be to our benefit. It would automatically move us towards more holiness. And that's what we look for in the age to come. But right now, it's not. The world groans in sin. And so we have to be very careful. And here's an important point. You can choose your worldview. And if you're not being intentional about it, it's being chosen for you. And some people, they're allowing their short-term interest to define their worldview. So my short-term interest for entertainment can have the effect of creating a worldview that works with my confirmation bias to lead me to make the world groan more in agony. It can justify my hatred of my neighbor. It can allow me to see things, to connect dots in ways that just aren't real. And I'll tell you, run an experiment on yourself, right? When I was teaching a class on this topic at the Naval War College, I encouraged them to immerse themselves, maybe just for a week, in a culture that wasn't their own, to see if it changed the way that they evaluated things, the things that they noticed. And they did, right? One of the authors that I like to read, he became attracted to the alt-right, right? And he was attracted to it through kind of the men of the West sort of thing. We need a more masculine Christianity and all this. And so this led him to a certain part of the Christian internet. And he was a traditional Catholic. And, he did it for that reason. He wanted a more responsible Christianity, more responsible institutions. But what came along with it was also this kind of a white nationalism, right? Because it supports the European ideal, right? And what that led to him, this is just me describing, okay? What that led him to notice is that after a few months of this, he started noticing people's race in a way that he didn't before. So if he saw a biracial couple, he would notice and evaluate, right? And that's when he finally said, no, this package is creating a worldview. He didn't use these words. He's a writer, so he wrote it better. This package is not healthy for me. I've done it for these other reasons, but the unintended consequence is these other parts have affected my worldview in a way that isn't healthy and isn't Christian. Because let's be clear, in Christ, there is no black and white. There is no Greek nor Jew. There is no male nor female. We do not evaluate people based on those things. We evaluate them based on their holiness. We recognize them through these other things because they're people. And those are important variables in their being a person. But we don't evaluate it based on that. There's a huge difference. With entertainment, if I'm not intentionally constructing, and he was being intentional in constructing his worldview. He's intentionally surrounding himself with Christian ideas and people who shared those ideas about a responsible Christianity, and it still led him that way. And I think that goes on the Orthodox parts of the Orthodox internet as well. There are things that get snuck in, right? And it leads people to evaluate priests bishops in an incredibly uncharitable way. So what you've done is you've sacrificed your Christianity for your masculine Christianity. Congratulations. Way to go. You know what? You can have masculine Christianity without bringing these other things in, right? Just maximize all those virtues, and every time you have to sacrifice one for the sake of another, repent, right? And keep yourself grounded in all of them. Okay. A lot of the people in our lives, typically not the people that would listen to a podcast or a live stream like this. A lot of people in our lives, they're not being intentional about forming their worldview, right? They get it from the home culture, and they get it from the YouTube, and they get it from the movies that they're watching. This is why, it's so important. Be careful what you watch, right? Because it influences your worldview. Your tolerance for certain things will change. And it's being constructed around you, and you're not picking it. It's okay if the people who are feeding you your entertainment, your news, have an Orthodox Christian worldview that's healthy, that they're not trying to manipulate you, then it's fine. You can relax. I can just enjoy this show. Man, superheroes, yay, right? Good versus evil, yay. Okay. But is that the case? Is it the case that these are people that you would bring into your dinner table with your children? Is this the kind of person you would allow to have free access to programming your brain? Because that's what you're doing. You're saying, yeah, for the sake of entertainment, you can rewire my brain, right? Man, keep the screen on, right? Keep the filter on. I mean, I love entertainment. I love watching movies. I love watching crime dramas mostly. But I've got to constantly reorient myself to these virtues. And how do you do that? By a prayer rule, by regular worship, because that's where you can let down that guard. You need to let down that guard and allow the perfect words of prayer, the perfect rhythms of the liturgy to go in. That's where you want your confirmation bias to come from, right? That's the way you want, more importantly, to construct your worldview, right? To allow the perfect words of prayer, the perfect rhythms, the patterns, the words of the liturgy to define who you are and how you relate to others, right? Then you'll be coming at it from a very well-grounded place of peace, a recognition of the need for harmony, and the charity, sacrifice, strength, courage, all these things, all these virtues will naturally flow from you and inform your discernment. And you'll also recognize the need to do all these things in community with others, even people who are different from you, think differently from you. Okay? So we've got to cultivate a worldview that promotes discernment, that promotes harmony, that promotes a dedication to truth and holiness. And it's not going to happen on its own. If you just live your life trying to be as good as possible, like most people do, your definition of good, your ordering of virtues, even the very facts that you focus on through confirmation bias, are going to be worldly. You cannot serve both God and the world. Who rules the world, right? Don't go there. Just allow orthodoxy, allow God, allow the Logos to pattern your way of thinking, to pattern your relationship with others. That's what we have to do, right? So one more thing, right? Going back to this, if you, O Lord, should mark iniquities. If we are operating from this center place, and we recognize how God relates to us, and we use that as a pattern of how we relate to others, it changes things. We don't look for excuses to hate people. We look for an excuse to connect with them, to know them, and to work that relationship, not through manipulation, not by trying to find the perfect words to say to them to get them to do the right thing, by awakening the desire to do good and to know good within their own hearts and to grow towards that together with you. That's what you're doing. Sometimes instruction is the right thing for that, right? But until you have that, until you have their trust, you really are just kicking a puppy. So we got to cut that out. I think what I'll talk about next time is a common. This is going to make it sound so dry. I promise you it'll be interesting. A common analytical mistake that people make that allows them to demonize other people, and that is by mislabeling, right? And I'll just give you a little hint of what'll be to come. So when I was an intelligence analyst, they gave us this cool tool. It was called Analyst Notebook. In an Analyst Notebook, you could create avatars, if you will. You could create little actors, and then you would populate them with attributes. And then you'd put them onto like a map, under their organizational map, or you could put them on a spatial map, like a country map. And then you would have it connect all of those players based on attributes. And if you programmed it right, it would allow you to see networks that wouldn't have been as visible before, because some of those attributes would be who they know, right? And then you could see who is related directly, who is related to second and third social ties, who is related by family, tribe, all this kind of stuff. It's very useful. You can see how that'd be useful. We had this young analyst. He came in just, I'm going to tease my brother James again, Subdeacon James. Probably should have been a tanker. James is really coming after me. Look, if you come down here, we'll have a beer. We'll joke about it, because these are jokes that go on, interbranch rivalry. So he had labeled. He had only done a small subset of, let's say it was the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan and some of the Taliban leadership. And he had put in as one of his labels, were they Sunni? Were they Sunni Muslim? And then he had drawn the connections, and he was like, oh, I figured it out. It's this scheme, right? It's this overall scheme. They're all connected. And if you don't think that's funny, I'm sorry, it is funny, because they're connected. They have the same faith. But that's like saying that the dude who goes to Second Baptist of Hartwell is in a conspiracy with the person at, in the Third Congregational Church of Providence. They're in a conspiracy. Yes, I know on some level they are. They're in a conspiracy for Christ or something like that. But it's crazy. But it happens all the time. It happens all the time. And polemicists and people who have bought into these weird worldviews, conspiratorial worldviews especially, they connect dots in a way, right? They connect these things in a way that, if you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, who should stand, right? If you, O fool, should mark that kind of foolishness, nobody could stand, right? Nobody can stand up to an entry-level analyst with Analyst Notebook. You can tie anybody to any kind of conspiracy or whatever. You can make me into a Bilderberger. People have done it. Because I'm a former military intelligence officer, so I'm obviously part of this grand conspiracy. And if for you that's easy to see, you need to rethink the kind of entertainment you're taking in, because your worldview is affected, right? Or maybe I'm just. I mean, after all, look at this, that, and the other. Right? No, come on, snap out of it. Come serve liturgy with me. You'll see who I am. All right, y'all. I sure do appreciate y'all coming. I hope you found this entertaining, if not useful. If you've got ideas of things that you'd like to hear me ruminate about, you can send me an email to father.anthony@yahoo.com. You can put a comment in the YouTube thing. I encourage you to subscribe, right? Ring the bell, whatever it is. If you like this kind of content, I've got a couple of podcasts. I've got Orthoanalytica, which is an independent podcast. And I've got Good Guys Wear Black on Ancient Faith Radio. And Father Harry and I, Lord willing, are starting another podcast for Ancient Faith Radio that'll be mine's more conversational, right? Good Guys Wear Black. This one will be more pedagogical. Because Father Harry's a smart guy, right? And we want to get as much content out there as possible. Well, brothers, sisters, until next time, Godspeed.